Welcome to the G5 Hive in our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we'll be taking a look at the Temple Owls, who finished 3-9 last season. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with their spring game on April 13th. We have a special guest today. He is a writer and recruiting analyst for the owlsdaily.com, which is a part of the 24/7 Sports Network. He is a Temple alumni. He is Ryan Wallen. He can be found at Ryan Wallen 247 on X. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you guys having me on.
We appreciate it very much. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you into journalism, covering Temple, and how long you've been covering the team?
Yeah, sure. So I attended Temple, like you already mentioned. I graduated from Temple in 2018. Coincidentally enough, I like to think that I was there for the golden years of Temple Owls football. Obviously getting to be there for 2015-16, that stretch of football under Matt Rule was probably the two best year stretch in program history. So that obviously is a highlight that I've gotten to cover some of those Temple teams. The 2015 season was actually the first year I started covering Temple for what was then Owls 247 on the 247 Sports Network, which eventually became Owls Daily once 247 bought Scout and they merged the sites. So I have been covering the team now for, I guess this will be my 9th full season covering the team. Since I was a sophomore in college, I ended up going to Temple because I was looking for a school that was going to give me the opportunity to do just what I got to do and what I still get to do in covering a Division I football program early on in my academic career at Temple, and hopefully setting myself up in the best position to get a job then once I got out of college. So, I visited Temple's campus in North Philadelphia, fell in love with immediately. It was such a change from where I grew up, which is in a town called New Oxford, a little outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm sure people will be a little more familiar with that town name, site of the Civil War battle. So, it was just a big change for me, and I got to go to Temple, and I had a great 4 years there, covering, like I mentioned, the football team there and basketball team, and, during the Fran Dunphy era. And since I've been out of Temple, I've still continued to cover the team for Owls Daily. Currently, like we were just talking about before the show, I'm setting up my classroom, going to be a first-year 4th grade teacher back in my home district. So really excited about that, and ready to get ready for the football season as well, because that's gearing up as well.
Absolutely. Football season is here. So those not familiar with the Owls' offensive play style, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so the last couple years, Temple's offensive play style has been a little different than what many would have probably remembered it as, I guess, during the Matt Rule years. During those Matt Rule, Jeff Collins years of Temple's success, their philosophy was very much ground and pound, control the clock play, hard-nosed football. They wanted to establish the run, and then they could, beat you over the top with the play action and kind of get their offense moving that way. And they did that really well. But the last couple years, even dating back to the Rod Carey era at Temple, it's kind of had to change because they just have not found success running the football like they had been under Rule and Collins. So, they've kind of gone to this type of offense where they kind of just want to establish the run, but they unfortunately usually can't. So it ends up just becoming a game of the quarterback trying to get the ball out quickly, just dump it out as fast as possible and, see what the playmakers on the team can do. I think you might see a little bit more of a return to the run first type offense this year, with the departure of EJ Warner having transferred to Rice this offseason. I think because Temple doesn't really have a proven commodity in the backfield right now as far as a running back, it's going to be a little bit of a committee approach again until somebody maybe establishes their footing and gets going. But, I think you still will see that mix of the last two kind of really big offensive schemes that they've attempted, where it's going to be try to establish the run, rely on the run heavily, but, have the quarterback still be quick decision making, try to get the ball out as quick as possible, because that's kind of what they've had to do the last couple of years. And I don't know necessarily if the problem has been fixed yet.
So let's get to that position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. You mentioned EJ Warner. He transfers to Rice. Quarterback number 2, Quincy Patterson. He's graduated. Forrest Brock had some game experience back in 2023. He went 7 of 15 for 60 yards and an INT. They brought in Evan Simon from Rutgers. How did this room shape up in the spring?
Yeah, I think what they were trying to do was they were trying to get a guy who was going to be a little bit more mobile than EJ. And I think that's what they've tried to go for with some of the quarterbacks that they are trying to bring in and they're trying to develop now. Because as good of a quarterback as EJ Warner was, he was not very mobile. That was not his bread and butter. And even when he had to throw on the run, he was not nearly as accurate or effective as he was when he was standing in the pocket and he had a clean pocket. So, Evan Simon and Forrest Brock both have more of that mobility aspect to their game compared to EJ. And I think that's going to help a little bit in the offense where the quarterback can maybe get out and tuck it and have to run if they need to and kind of extend plays a little bit more if they're getting rushed by, opposing defenses. So, it pretty much, obviously, it was an open competition in the spring, and it still is going to be that way throughout the fall as well. I think it was a little unexpected by most people that EJ was transferring, especially given where he transferred to. A lot of people view that as a lateral move to Rice, despite, Rice's recent success in starting to turn that program around. Still in the same conference though, and not really a payday was not really a factor, it seemed like, in EJ's decision. So it was a little unexpected. But I think, like I mentioned, I think they're just trying to get a little bit more mobile in that regard. And it's just going to be an open competition here over the next couple weeks to see who's really going to, take that opportunity and be the person that's going to step on the field with the first team offense against Oklahoma on August 31st.
Do you feel that Brock has maybe a leg up being in the system for a year, or do you think it really helps having that P4, practice time and everything else there that Simon has at Rutgers?
Yeah, I think definitely coming out of the spring, what I saw, I think Brock had the leg up. He just looked a little sharper. Knew the offense obviously a lot better, considering he had been, like you mentioned, in the system for a year at that point, and just familiarity with some of the guys on the team and all. But I also do think that Simon brings a talent aspect. Obviously, he had won the starting job at Rutgers, which you mentioned is a P4 school and in one of the top 2 conferences in all of college football in the Big Ten. So, Simon has something there that obviously Greg Schiano, who, had a stint in the NFL, saw in him, that he earned that starting position at Rutgers. So I think that maybe the longer Simon is in the offense, the more he learns now that he has a summer under his belt. Maybe he will catch up, and that gap between him and Brock has narrowed a little bit, and maybe he will make it more of a competition. Like I said, over the next couple of weeks heading into fall camp.
Can you describe both Brock's and Simon's game for us? I know you mentioned they were a bit more mobile than Warner was, but can you tell us a little bit about each of them?
Yeah, so from what I've seen, obviously Brock I've seen a lot less of, just because coming from a JUCO school and out in California, it's a little hard to gain some footage on him. And fortunately enough, Temple had played Evan Simon and Rutgers twice over the last couple years, so we've seen him in game action against Temple's defense. So we've seen what he can be able to do. So, but from what I have seen from Brock, like I said, the mobility aspect obviously is there. He's the bigger bodied of the two compared to Simon as far as his height. He probably has the stronger arm of the two as well. I would say Simon is more of the quick release guy, but Brock probably is the better decision maker out of the bunch. So I guess I would say Brock's probably also more accurate from what I've seen. Now, granted, what I saw was a spring game where they were not counting sacks and some things were rushed a little bit and some early whistles and whatnot. So that's what I've seen. But I think, like I said, in the right system, Evan Simon probably could be a very effective quarterback at the G5 level. And I would not be surprised, if Brock goes out and has a bad couple series, if he is the starter come the Oklahoma opener and he has a bad couple series, Evan Simon's probably right there getting some reps then early in that game, because I don't think Temple's just going to lay down and try to lose that game. They want to establish some momentum and actually get this ship turned around.
So let's move over to the running game. Their leading rusher from a year ago, Darvin Hubbard, has entered the portal. Edward Sadie is off to Gardner-Webb. Joquez Smith returns and adds Antoine Littleton II from Maryland. How did that room look in the spring? Yeah,
I think from what I've seen from them so far is now they actually have some speed back there. They have some guys that have some playmaking ability. And you mentioned, Hubbard and Sadie, who were both solid running backs, but they weren't very much the same type of player, where they didn't have great footwork and they really didn't have breakaway speed. And that's not really too good when that's something that you are relying on so heavily in your offense, where you need to establish the run and make guys miss at the point of contact and whatnot. So I think right now you have that in Joquez and Littleton, because Joquez is a very small 5'8" on a good day type back, very small back, but he has that burst of speed and he has some incredible footwork for being someone who was a true freshman last year and, was playing high school football 8 months prior to him coming to Temple, and he made some guys really miss at all levels of the defense. So I'm excited to see what an off season of him now being in this system, working with it a little more, and what he's able to now recognize and see now that he's probably more familiar with the playbook. And now you have a bruiser back in Littleton, who has had a lot of success at Maryland. He was a guy that ran for multiple touchdowns against Michigan State in a game against them when he was at Maryland. He's a bruiser back, much bigger bodied guy. And there's some guys like Tyree Washington and EJ Wilson who Temple also has that have depth, and they're going to be on, all competing for snaps. Because like I mentioned earlier, I think it's still going to be a running back by committee until somebody really gets their feet under them and gets Temple what they need in this offense, and it's just as being a consistent running back who's able to rip off 4, 5, 6, 7 yard carries.
So last season we saw this running back by committee approach, and you said that's kind of what they would like to see, but we had that between Hubbard, Smith, and Sadie, and it was kind of just split up pretty evenly amongst the three there. Do you think that when we do see this running back by committee that it is that even distribution load, or do we see like Antoine more inside the 20s or inside the 5, or what do you kind of see how that stuff gets split up?
Yeah, I think definitely Joquez is going to be more of the every down back between or outside of the 20s, between the 20s, I guess I should say. And then Littleton probably will be the guy who comes in the red zone and goal line situations, especially because, he's every bit of 235, 240, pushing probably even more. They probably slimmed him down on the roster, and he looks every part of it, and his legs are just massive. So he'll just be a guy I think that you'll see in those types of situations. But we saw him a little bit in the spring, what he could do out of the backfield. Between the 20s, which looked good. And then I think Tyree probably is going to be the other guy that's going to get most of the work, probably substituting in for Joe Kez. I think he's another guy that is a big bodied back, but he also has that speed that I think he can just make plays. And you've seen that already in the works.
So who do we see get that first carry there against Oklahoma?
I think if I had to put money on it right now, I think Joe Kez is probably the guy that's going to start. Stan Drayton really likes him. He's a guy that they identified early on in the recruiting cycle. In 2023, they were able to keep him. He was a very productive back out of Florida, helped his high school team win a state championship there and set all kinds of rushing records down there. Very similar to Stan Drayton, who is a running back by nature. And when he was in college at Allegheny, and obviously that's his position that he coached when he was at Texas. So he really liked Joe Kez coming out of high school. And I think that he's going to be the guy unless, barring an injury or something happening between now and then.
All right. Well, let's take a look at this receiving room. The receivers look strong heading into 2024. Their leading receiver in terms of yardage from 2023, Ahmad Anderson Jr. graduated, but everyone else returns, and they added Antonio Jones from Grambling State. How did this group look in the spring?
Yeah, I think they looked a little shaky in the spring. There were still quite a few drops, which is concerning, but I would also say they were shaky because they were very injury depleted in the spring. They were missing quite a few of those guys in the spring game. It kind of tapers back to the end of last season where they just had some guys go down with injuries. And they were playing some walk-ons, and even one of their walk-ons, John Adams, who had a phenomenal game against UTSA last year. He ended up breaking his leg pretty severely, and he's now full go. He's returned, so that obviously adds some depth to this team, but it's very much up in the air because a lot of these guys either weren't with the team in the spring or were injured. And so they were playing a decent amount of walk-ons this spring. Dante Wright's the only real guy that I got a real good look at this spring who's a returner. Zay Baines was out there a little bit, but he's had drop problems over the last couple of years. So Dante is probably the most healthy and the most consistent out of the bunch. But a lot of the other guys, it's still up in the air as to who's going to be the people that really take the reins, and they're going to be the ones that are starting.
Well, when you said that, some of the receivers were injured, and there was a lot of like walk-ons getting some playing time. Did anybody kind of stand out to you there in the spring?
The guy I think that probably played the most and was really earning his time was Cole Sprague, who's a walk-on wide receiver. He really just showed that he could be maybe, another John Adams like last year, where he just waits his time, and if some injuries happen ahead of him, he's going to see the field, and he earned that. And he actually started with the first team offense in the spring game, opposite Dante Wright. So that was a little bit of a surprise. Obviously I don't anticipate him starting against Oklahoma, and I would hope Temple probably is hoping that as well, considering that they're going to be going up against a very good Oklahoma team in Norman. So but that's what I would say we're at right now. It's going to be interesting to see the next couple of weeks, just really how healthy they are at that position, especially, and what some of these guys do bring to the table that they brought in since spring. You mentioned Antonio Jones. They also brought in Ashton Allen, who was on the USC track team as a grad transfer from USC. He hasn't played football since high school, but dude wanted to play football. Temple had an open scholarship. They talked him through it, and he said he wants to play football. So going to see what he does in his last year of eligibility, and maybe, Temple found a diamond in the rough with him.
Yeah, mate, that's something. At least jet sweep, something fast, So let's move over to the tight ends. This tight end group is, a lot of people don't like to talk about tight ends, but Temple likes the tight ends. If you were to describe how tight ends are utilized in this offense to somebody who's never caught a Temple game, how would you describe it?
Yeah, they like to feature their tight ends, and this is something that Danny Langsdorf loves to use. He likes to use a lot of like illusion type plays where the tight ends look like they're going to be blocking and staying and blocking, or they're going to be just setting a screen or something, and then they release and they go out for a pass. And he has done a phenomenal job the last 2 years, I think, in utilizing tight ends, because that was an argument of Rod Carey's offense when Rod Carey was the head coach of Temple and Mike Aremovich was running the offense there, that they just didn't use the talent they had in the tight end room. And they had some of these same guys that they flourished these last 2 years, like David Martin Robinson and Jordan Smith. And I think they just did a phenomenal job at that the last couple years. And they've kind of really been the best group of the offense, I would say, in my opinion. They've been the most consistent performing. They've been the guys who've made plays when Temple's really needed them. And I just think that hopefully that trend is able to continue. But, I think especially how vital they're going to be this year with a new quarterback who has, who's going to need to get rid of the ball fast. Those tight ends are going to be very key in that position. So we'll see what they can do with them this year again.
Well, you mentioned those two big losses in this room, David Martin Robinson and Jordan Smith. They've both graduated. That leaves Reese Clark and Peter Clark as the returning guys in 2023. But the listeners and fans need to know another name in this room, and that's Landon Morris. He sat out 2023 due to the double transfer rules, which kind of sucks because now the transfer rules don't matter anymore. He was with Syracuse in 2021 before transferring to Utah, where then he redshirted and, as I mentioned, had to sit out all of 2023. Can you tell us a little bit about this room?
Yeah, obviously Landon Morris is going to be the wild card here. We heard a lot of good things about him from what we heard from practice last year when he was able to, practice with the team, but obviously not able to suit up. We heard a lot of good things that he's going to be like the next David Martin Robinson. He's very similar type build to DMR, probably a little faster than him, but maybe not as bulky, but very similar body type, very similar physique, and how I think Temple's going to end up utilizing him this year. Reese Clark, you mentioned, he's probably been the guy that I've pegged is going to be a breakout player for this team this year. And I know that's one of your questions later, but I'll go ahead and throw his name out there now, because he has just gone from a kid who 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever he joined the program, he was a guy who looked like he should be playing wide receiver. He was very scrawny, didn't look very quick, wasn't very sure-handed, but he has taken this seriously, and Stan Drayton has praised Reese Clark on his mindset and his maturity over the last couple years of getting himself ready for this moment. So he's put on weight, but he's still a leaner tight end. But he's also a guy that Temple's going to run jet sweeps with. We've seen it in practice throughout the spring. We saw it last spring, and he's got some speed to the edge, and I think when you have that type of versatility at the tight end position, that adds a whole new dynamic to your offense that, you have to make opposing defenses account for that type of play that could be coming. So I think he's going to be a very integral part of this offense this year. Peter Clark, on the other hand, another guy who made a lot of plays through the NFL Academy in London. Caught a touchdown last year. I believe he had a broken hand at the time, and he was wearing a cast on his hand when he did it. Just a tough London kid, very, very physical, not afraid to get up in guys' faces, even though he was a true freshman last year. I think he's going to see a lot of time this year as well, rotating in with Morris and Clark. And then the fourth tight end there, obviously James Della Pesca, who's going to be a grad student this year. He's a guy who's just very integral in the blocking aspect of what Temple's trying to do. So he will see the field a lot. You might not see him make plays, but he's going to be making those blocking type plays that Temple really needs to make in order to get that run game going.
Let's move over to this offensive line. They lost 2 starters to the portal, 1 to graduation. That leaves their left tackle and right guard coming back from a year ago. They have some guys returning too that played some meaningful snaps in 2023. Plus, they bring in Grayson Maines from South Carolina. What are your expectations for this O-line here in 2024?
My expectation, or my hope, I guess you should say, is that this offensive line is going to stay healthy. I mean, this is a group that has just been absolutely depleted by injuries the last 2 seasons. It is an absolutely crazy stat, and if you want to go look at it, if you're listening to this, and if you don't believe me, but I think out of Temple's last 24 games, they've had 23 or 22 different offensive line combinations.
Wow.
In those games, and only 1 week has it been back-to-back the same, or 2 weeks where it's been back-to-back the same offensive line, and that was the early on in this past season. So just injuries, not performing up to standards. It's just been a rough go of it for this offensive line unit the last couple of years, and that is something that Temple desperately needs to see an improvement in. This unit has been pretty decent in protecting the quarterback, I would say. The last couple of years, I guess 2 years ago when EJ first started playing quarterback for Temple, he was only sacked, I think, 6 times all season, which when you look at that on paper, you're like, wow, phenomenal. That's a great offensive line. But, last year, I think he was still only sacked maybe 10, 12 times, but he was getting hit a lot more. And he eventually did get injured at one point, which cost him a couple weeks, and saw Temple have to play Patterson and eventually Forrest Brock too because of that injury to Warner. So they definitely need to be better at protecting their passer this year and allowing him to not get hit as much, whoever that quarterback ends up being. And they desperately need the run game to get going, because I don't think that if you see a very similar trend to the last couple years with this offensive line, Temple's not going to be competing for anything this year.
Well, you kind of alluded to it with Reese Clark as kind of a breakout guy, but if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be? I'm assuming Reese Clark, and maybe give us another one.
Yeah, I think Reese Clark's the one I mentioned. If I want to say a sleeper, I think just the rebound of Ian Stewart. Ian Stewart is a guy who transferred from Michigan State a couple years ago, earned a single digit for Temple. And for those that don't know about Temple's single digit tradition, the single digit numbers on their jerseys are awarded to the toughest players, both on and off the field. And that is a very prestigious honor, because those who earn single digits tend to be the guys who end up going on to play at the next level. And just, there's been guys like PJ Walker and Tyler Medikevich and Deion Dawkins and guys like that who have all Hassan Reddick, guys who earned single digits at Temple, who went on to have very successful NFL careers. So that is something that is valued at Temple. And Ian Stewart, we really haven't gotten to see what he can do fully in a Temple uniform since he's gotten here, because he was injured early on in his first year at Temple with a foot injury, and it kind of just lingered on all through last season, and he really didn't see the field much. So I really want to see what he can do. He's ready to go. I know he's itching to get out there and show the world what he can do, because he's had a couple years of him robbed now because of an injury. And I just want to see what kind of a leader he can be when he is on the field with the offense, and what kind of a difference he makes, just being that wide receiver who's a taller target, who's going to possibly be the number one big playmaker receiver.
So let's move over to the defensive side of the ball. For our listeners not familiar with the Owls defense, what kind of scheme does Coach Withers run there?
Yeah, so technically, I guess you would call it a 4-3. Coach Withers is all about trying to load the box, but a lot of the times Temple will line up in a 4-2-5 is what it usually pans out being, and that's what you're going to primarily see as their base defense. Aside from when they probably play the triple option teams of Army and Navy, where they will run the 4-3 more to just try to shut down the run there. So this will be their second year under coach Everett Withers, who returned to Temple after Temple lost their defensive coordinator to the Eagles a couple years ago. So that's where they're at. Obviously, their defense needs to improve because it had not been good the last couple seasons. They need to see a vast improvement and possibly return to those days where, DJ Elliott was running the Temple defense in Stan Drayton's first year, and they were at least, getting to the quarterback, and they were shutting down the pass and at least keeping themselves in games opposed to being blown out. So that is something that's going to desperately need a change, and they brought in a lot of new faces on the defensive side of the ball.
Well, let's start on that defensive line. It's going to look green here in 2024. Between the portal and graduation, the Owls lost Jerquavion Mahoney, Davian Hood, Zamir Cobbs. However, the team brings back guys like Conlon Green, Alan Hay, and Demerick Morris. They also add Cameron Stewart from Rutgers here before the spring. How did that group look in the spring?
Yeah, again, this is unfortunately another position group who was depleted by injuries last year. I think out of everybody you mentioned there, everybody was injured except Conlon Green at one point or another. Mahone missed a couple games. Hood missed a couple games. Cobbs was a walk-on who cost Temple a game there at the end of the season. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but he solely cost them a game against USF that they could have possibly won because of a stupid penalty that he just let his emotions get out of the control and get the better of him there. But like you mentioned, those three are gone. They have Conlon Green, who was a true freshman last year, playing a lot of snaps. He's returning. Alan Hayes coming off of an injury, who he tore his ACL last season. Demerick Morris was banged up quite a bit last season, off and on. He was injured in the spring game, but he's a full go again. Alan Hay is a full go. It's going to be whether, again, this unit can stay healthy. It is desperately needed that they stop the run, because that is where teams have just taken advantage of this team the last several years, is they are able to control this clock, run the ball down their throat, get that defense tired, and then they just beat them with a big play, either in the run or the pass game. So, it's good to have guys that have now played a lot and they have depth there because of the injuries that they've kind of suffered the last couple years. But it's whether they're now going to mesh together and they're going to be able to play as an established unit. The good thing is that they're probably going to just play, a two nose tackle front, and then they're going to have two other guys playing more on the edge as edge rushers. You mentioned Cameron Stewart from Rutgers. He's going to be more one of those edge guys, but I think he has the ability to move inside if they need him to, and have a little bit more of a mobile or more athletic nose tackle. And then they added a guy from FAU, Latrell Jean, after the spring, who was highly complimented by Florida Atlantic coach Tom Herman last week at the American Athletic Conference, kickoff conference. My editor for my site at owlsdaily.com, Sean Pastor, he specifically asked Coach Herman about Latrell, and he complimented him to the highest regards and said, I hope he's going to get what he's looking for there. He's still a proud FAU alum, but I hope, all the best for him. And he's just a freakishly athletic, big bodied, experienced defensive tackle that they wanted back at FAU.
So you mentioned Stewart and Jean. Who are the other two that are probably going to make up this line?
Yeah, I think Stewart starts at one end, and then Jean and Hay or Morris are going to be the starting D tackles. Demerick is a guy who I probably anticipate earning a single digit for Temple, just given, the struggles he's been through, the adversity he's overcome, and now having been the most experienced and veteran guy in that room, I would say he's probably the guy that's going to end up starting at the other DT position opposite Gene. And then I think they actually tend to go with a smaller edge rusher on the opposite side. I think that ends up probably being Trey Thomas, who technically is listed as a linebacker, but he's more of an edge guy. He's a guy that played there a lot last year. He, just more quick off the edge, a little bit more speed there. And I think he's going to be a guy that probably ends up making up the other edge.
All right, well, let's talk about that linebacking group. They lose their leading tackler, Jordan McGee, to the NFL. Their third and fourth leading tacklers from a year ago have also graduated. Like you talk about here, this room is highlighted by Trey Thomas. He's on there as a linebacker, but playing more of that edge. How did this linebacking group look in the spring?
Yeah, I think this is probably the biggest question mark on the team that I have heading into fall camp and into the season, because they brought in 7 new linebackers this offseason. It's going to be the biggest crapshoot, I would say. It's hard to say who's going to start at this point, I think, because they were just rotating guys in left and right and trying out different combinations. I think they were just trying to see what was going to stick throughout the spring, and I think you're going to see that here the first couple weeks of camp as well. But I think what they were trying to do there is to try to take some of the workload off some of those guys who are playing every down and just establish some depth, because, again, they had injuries there last year that really hurt them. You mentioned Jordan McGee, who's now with the Commanders in the NFL. Obviously, he's a huge loss to replace and big shoes to fill there. So it's going to be quite a challenge to replace those guys. But, I think that's why they made linebackers such a priority in their recruiting cycle, because they need to replace that production, and they need some very athletic, versatile linebackers who can cover a lot of ground in this type of defensive scheme that Withers wants to run.
And you mentioned, they kind of looked at the linebackers to recruit in the portal. Did anybody stand out to you in the spring? Anybody that was coming back or any of these transfers?
Yeah, I think Tyquan King from East Carolina is a guy who was praised early on by Withers and Coach Chris Woods, who's the linebackers coach at Temple. They really like his game. He's really athletic, really long, speedy. Eric Stewart's another guy who got a lot of work. They really like him out of the JUCO level. He very well could be the first or second team linebacker. He was getting reps with the ones in the spring game. But I think right now they're going to probably, if I had to put money on it right now, have 2 guys who are more familiar with the system be the starters come week 1, in Antoine Santiago and DJ Woodbury. Woodbury started to see more playing time towards the middle of the season last year, and then unfortunately he suffered a season-ending injury where he was not able to practice throughout the spring as well. So Woodbury, I would say he was a guy that kind of has that veteran presence that they're looking for, who already knows the system. He's been here 4 years now. I think he's probably going to end up being that Jordan McGee-esque player, or he's going to be the signal caller for the defense, basically. And Santiago is just a guy who's, again, similar to Reese Clark, Stan Drayton has praised about his maturity, how he's actually taken his development seriously to get to the point where he is. And now he has an opportunity to become that starting linebacker that they really need. And I think he might be the guy that ends up getting that second linebacker spot for them.
Well, this defensive backfield lost a decent chunk of guys to the portal, and then the team's second leading tackler from a year ago, Twan Francis, graduated. However, the portal taketh and the portal giveth. If my counting's correct, they brought in 6 transfers. What should we expect from this defensive backfield in 2024?
Yeah, kind of like this is where they lost the majority of their players, and they lost the majority of their production from last year as far as percentage of snaps taken on their team. It's going to be pretty much a whole new backfield. I think the only guy who probably will see significant playing time, or the only two guys who played a little bit last year, was Elijah Darraville and Ben Aswike, who are both corners. Other than that, it's going to be two new safeties, three new safeties if you really count if they throw in that they call it a Sam position or an owl position. They have different terminologies for it at Temple, but it's going to be quite interesting to see how some of these guys mesh together, because they're all coming from different levels of college football and obviously have had different successes and different experiences in getting to this point. We saw what we would like to have seen from the safeties in the spring, especially. I thought the safeties looked phenomenal in the spring game, led by Andres Keaton, who comes to Temple from Western Carolina, was an all-conference player at the FCS level there at Western Carolina with the Catamounts. I think he's really going to be a guy to watch this year for Temple. I think he is sneaky good and could be competing for all conference honors in the American this year. And another guy, Javier Morton, looked really good in the spring. He was being moved around to different positions. He was playing a little bit of that owl position that Temple likes to call it. He was playing traditional free safety. He was playing strong safety, and he just looks like a guy who's kind of a Swiss Army knife that they have back there. As far as cornerbacks go, I think what they lined up with in the spring game was Darraville had moved from safety to corner because he's a little quicker and a little smaller frame. So I'm thinking that they want a little bit more speed at that corner position with him now moving there, just because they've had such a problem in getting beat deep the last couple years. So he moves to corner now, and then Torrey Richardson, who's a guy from UTEP who transferred in. Again, very solid, experienced starting cornerback at UTEP, who I think Temple's hoping that can come in and, be just that lockdown number one corner, because they lost Jalen McMurray to Tennessee this offseason. He was their number one corner, obviously, having transferred up. They need that guy who's going to be reliable, and that's just going to shut down teams opposing number ones.
So when we mentioned earlier, Taiwan Francis playing more of that like owl, that Sam kind of role there, coming down. Who's going to step up into that particular position, do you think?
Yeah, I think the guy that probably is going to actually step up into that safety position is going to be either Javier Morton or Jalen Lewis. Jalen Lewis is another guy who they brought in this offseason who transferred in from Arkansas. Very versatile player, again, has played corner in the past, has a relationship with Temple's secondary coach, Dominique Bowman, who was at Arkansas when he was recruited there. So knows him, knows his play style, and I think that Dominique Bowman's going to obviously put him in the best position where Jalen's going to get to play and succeed, and he might very well be that owl position that has that versatility, and where he might, have to go down and play a little linebacker, but also can back off into coverage. And another guy, Ashim Smith-Marset, he looked really good in the spring game. He made a couple pass breakups, some big hits. He's a guy who came in late and signed with Temple late last recruiting cycle as part of the 2023 class. And obviously in less than a year, he earned his way onto starting with the number one defense in the spring game. And he's making plays. So I think he's gonna be in that equation to possibly see playing time and make an impact with the Temple defense. And he just comes from good genes. His brother's in the NFL, I believe won a Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs. So that is the Smith-Marset who has an NFL pedagogy.
Well, if you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who'd that be?
Yeah, I want to say that a guy I haven't mentioned who I neglected, who had a really good season last year for Temple and was one of the bright spots after transferring in from Florida was DeJuan Black. He's another guy who kind of plays that same position Trey Thomas does. He's probably not as, I don't want to say as athletic. He's not as versed, I guess, as doesn't have as wide of a skill set, I guess, as Trey Thomas does as far as football is. But DeJuan Black is probably the most athletic player on Temple's team. He is just a freak athlete, and he is long, he is fast, and he is a mean player. And I think when he gets on the field, Temple or opposing teams' offensive lines need to factor him in and double cover him because he is just a guy who will get to the quarterback at whatever cost. And he is just a guy who has a chip on his shoulder after, leaving Florida and having been at the JUCO level for several years. He's just a guy who wants to make a name for himself. So he's a guy I would like to really see step up, and maybe he expanded his skill set in the offseason, and maybe he makes a little bit more of an impact on the team than he did last year.
Well, fall camp opened up today, I believe, right?
Yes, correct.
All right. Which position group or groups do you feel has the most opportunity for growth here in 2024?
I think the most growth, I would say, is the offensive line. I think they're the group that needs to step up the most in order for Temple to be successful this upcoming season. Sure, Temple had weaknesses at all three levels of the defense last year. They had weaknesses in the run game. But I think a lot of their problems in the run game were because of the lack of growth that the offensive line took last year and the injuries that piled up. And I think they're the group that needs to grow the most. Offensive line coach Chris Wiesahan, he had been at Temple under Matt Rule. He produced guys in the NFL like Deion Dawkins, like a Matt Hennessy. So he knows how to take guys and develop them. It's just having had to retool and now deal with the injury factor. I think that has been the problem of why they haven't necessarily developed and grown like they needed to. But I think they did a really good job this offseason of bringing in some guys who are a little more athletic than they had previously along the offensive line. And hopefully, they're ready to play because we've seen injuries play a factor, and Temple was playing freshmen on the offensive line last year, and they might need to do it again. But, I think right now, if I had to say the offensive line, it's probably looking like Luke Watson at left tackle, Eric King at left guard, Grayson Maines, who's a center transfer out of South Carolina. He's probably going to start at center. Stan Drayton said today it's his job to lose at center. So going to have a new center there for them. A guy who missed all of last year due to an off-the-field issue, James Faminu, returns to their lineup. Very underrated guy, I think, that a lot of people forgot about Temple having, who played a lot for Temple the previous season and had some time at Houston. I think he's another guy that's probably going to get a lot of playing time and start at that right guard position. And then at right tackle, it's kind of up in the air right now. They're going to be rotating some guys in there. Maybe he starts, or maybe Faminu moves over to tackle, and then Temple works in a guy, Eric King, who also was a freshman last year and really, really high on him. At one point was committed to Syracuse, and they really like him. They were able to flip him late. So he probably gets thrown at the other guard position opposite Quarshie, then Maines at center, and then Faminu and Watson are the tackles.
All right. Well, we talked about the opportunity. Well, what's the strength of this team going into 2024?
I think the strength is the fact that they're healthy. That, I think, is a tremendous strength that they have not had since Stan Drayton's been on North Broad Street. And that's a little bit of a off-the-cuff answer, I know, but it is something that I don't think people realize sometimes, the drop-off in talent of your ones versus your twos, and then your twos versus your threes. And when you have guys who are able to get in a rhythm and practice together day in and day out, and they're healthy, the consistency that you can actually get going in an offense or a defense, and just that familiarity to really trust your brother to do what he's supposed to do and do his job. And that's something that Stan Drayton likes to throw around there is, we're a family, we're all brothers, but you need to do your job. And if you're not going to do your job, we're going to put somebody else in there that's going to do your job. So I think that is probably the biggest strength that they have heading into fall camp, is just that they're healthy. I think that there are other areas of the team that have potential, but I wouldn't say that there is a strength that just stands out to me right now. Obviously, I think with fall camping starting in the next couple of weeks, we'll start to see some of those strengths a little bit more present themselves. But if we're going to go by a position group or a strength, I would say right now, I would put my money on the defensive line being the strength. I think that the veteran presences that they have in that room now, and the experience they have there, and the talent and the athleticism, I think that they could be a very sneaky good defensive line in the American come the season.
Well, that's a good strength to have. Anytime you can have that defensive line be a strength, that's what you want to see. When it comes to the recruitment of new players and the retention of existing players, how have you seen the NIL and the transfer portal impact Temple?
Yeah, so obviously it's impacted every college out there, every FBS, FCS school that there is, because, having to pay players now and basically re-recruit them every year to stay and, say, we want you to be here. Like it's definitely changed the game of college football. And obviously people compare it to how it's NFL free agency now with the transfer portal and whatnot. But in this sense, you really don't have contracts, so it can change so much year to year. And Temple has seen that be the case. The guys that have sniffs of talent or a lot of talent and they prove themselves, they tend to leave because Temple doesn't have the funding or the donors to retain some of those players. And, they've seen that with some of their players leaving for bigger schools. And we even saw this before, really, the transfer portal became as popular, I guess you could say, as it was, and became such an integral part of the game. Guys like Quincy Roche, who left Temple after winning Conference Defensive Player of the Year, and then he went to Miami and he was on the twos at Miami. It's sometimes you just don't, obviously that's a cliche to say, but sometimes the grass isn't always greener on the other side. It's worked out for some Temple players. It's not worked out for others. I'm sure it has been with all the other colleges and universities in FBS and FCS. But I think for Temple especially, it has been very hard to recruit and retain players like you mentioned, because they were a little late to the game, in my opinion, in getting involved in NIL. I don't think they took it seriously enough when it really came about. And let's face it, they don't have a very great donor base. There's numbers out there and there's stories out there from city media outlets in Philadelphia, other Temple media outlets who've reported it. Temple's NIL funding was less than that of Wichita State's. And that's not good when you have a school that's not even an FBS school, doesn't have a football team. Sure, they're in the same conference in basketball, but they're outfunding you. That's not a great look for Temple, in my opinion. And you start to see and hear from other sources and other schools in the same conference how their numbers are compared to what Temple's is. And I won't name schools or names, but when they're getting donors who are now just throwing, $1 million here and $1 million there, and they're meeting their budgets within, or their funding goals in 6 months rather than in the full year, and Temple's still lagging behind a little bit, it's like, well, that's not good either. So in my opinion, obviously, I don't think as a Temple fan, you could realistically expect Temple to win if you don't put the funding into NIL and you want these players to stay. You need to donate the money to keep them here. And that's been extremely hard, I think, for Temple in both keeping current players and recruiting, obviously, players to come to Temple. So they're starting to catch up a little bit more. They've started more funds. They've tried to get involved a little bit more in the city as far as, and partnering with different brands as far as getting more money for some of their players, but it's still a challenge. But I think they're trying to get there. It's just how quick can they figure it out? And are you going to have another coaching change before that happens? Because if you have another coaching change, all bets are off, and pretty much everybody's going to leave.
Yep. Well, it seems more and more that the demands of a head coach are really turning into more of a general manager role between recruiting high school seniors, player retention, almost seems like game to game for your team, fundraising, and less of the X's and O's role. Do you see this trend happening there at Temple with Coach Drayton?
Yeah, absolutely. And he's not shied away from this issue. He's been asked this several times over the last couple of years since he's been at Temple, and he has said, it's a totally different role than being a position coach. It is the going out and meeting the fans and trying to raise money to keep players, and you're constantly recruiting players, and like I said, re-recruiting players every year to year, even at times month to month, with all the transfer opportunities obviously that they have throughout the year now. So it's really more of, like you said, a general manager role. And I don't know if I've heard people refer to that before, but that's a good way to put it, that it's not, being a head coach in college football is not about managing the team as much anymore. You kind of have to leave that to your staff, and you got to be doing everything else while overseeing the whole operation and just ensuring that you're bringing in guys that will fit the system and fit the mentality in the locker room that you're trying to build. And, Stans has said, he kind of does not like the way that college football is going, but you have to adapt to it. And he's not shied away from adapting to it. I think he's done the best he can with what he's been given. I have been impressed, especially this year, with what he was able to bring in with some of these more experienced veteran type players rather than going the JUCO route in some regards. And it was kind of like, oh, how did he get that caliber of player? I thought they might not have the ability to get them based on the money they have or the lure. But you just have this type of aura about the whole system now, that it's generally negative, against a negative perception of college football now from some of those more veteran head coaches who have been around a much longer time around the game more, whereas some of the younger head coaches are all about the change. So I think Stan kind of falls in that more traditional old school coaching mentality, where he wishes he could be doing a little bit more of the X's and O's, but he's also just had to, he knows he has to adapt to it, because if not, his team's not going to be successful.
Well, what does success look like for the Owls in 2024?
Yeah, I think there is pressure on Stan right now. I think that if we're sitting here in 5 months, end of December, and Temple's coming off another 3-9 season, or worse, maybe even 4-8, I'm thinking probably Temple's going to be looking for a new head coach. There is an expectation that Temple will be competitive again, because that is something that has evaded the Owls the last 4 seasons. They've not been competitive as people would have expected them to be. They've not been, I guess, engaged as people would have wanted them to be. And they need it because, like I said, you can't expect to have success in college football if you're not winning. And you're not going to get the donors if you're not winning, or at least being competitive in your conference. So I think what success looks like for them this year is that they need to show obvious growth in various areas of the game. They need to be a team that will be hopefully around 500. I think they really need to try to reach that 6-win mark. I think they really need to try to strive for a bowl game this year. I don't expect them to win a conference mentality or win the conference. Obviously, that's something that coach speak is going to say, well, our goal is always to go 1-0 every week and win the conference, and that's our goal for the season. But do I realistically think that? No. But I do think that they need to get to that 6-win mark, play in a bowl game, whether they win or lose. I think that buys Drayton another year. I think that helps people in their support of the program again. I think that just gets people eyes back on the program, and maybe that helps. And another recruiting cycle of Drayton's guys coming in and Rod Carey's guys going out, I think maybe then they can start again building something to return to, I guess, what they would be hoping for is a conference title contender next year.
Well, we've kind of covered a lot here on Temple so far tonight. Is there anything else you want to share or think that we need to know about this 2024 Temple Owls football team?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've noticed is that it's a change of mentality that's happening in North Broad Street, and Stan has tried to institute it the last 2 years, and I think now that his guys are cycling into those prominent playing roles, that this is going to be a team that's going to be a very tight-knit group. Everybody obviously wants to be a brotherhood as a football team, but you really feel that with the way Drayton presents himself around his players, and he loves these guys. It's very much like Matt Rule in his way of how he treats his players and how his players respect him. You always hear that these players really love Drayton. They do want him to succeed. And that was something that was missing at Temple under the previous coaching staff with Rod Carey. And that's not a knock to Rod, because I do think Rod was a very good football coach. He just didn't connect with the type of players that Temple had at the time. And then obviously when Rod left, it was a big change that players felt, are we going to get another coach that we're not going to connect with? But I think Stan has proven over the last 2 years that he loves his players. He loves this job. He loves the city of Philadelphia, and he wants Temple to win. And he wants to return Temple to those glory days of the Matt Rule era, the Al Golden era, the early Jeff Collin years. He wants this team to be successful. And I think if he keeps that mentality, and like I said, he just somehow finds a way to get that team to that 6-7 win mark, and they exceeded a little bit of expectations this year, obviously having been picked to finish last in the conference in the media poll. I think if he exceeds expectations this year and surprises some people, I think he's going to earn a lot of points in the eyes of the fan base and obviously within the conference too.
Well, Ryan, we want to thank you again for taking time out of your day to spend with us and share your knowledge of the Temple Owls. I
appreciate it. I appreciate you guys having me on. Thanks for having me. And I'm glad I get to talk about Temple and college football, as part of my job.
All right. Well, if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.